Tonight on Ukraine Today, a Ukrainian drone strike hits the Tambov gunpowder factory, one of Russia's key suppliers of explosives for the military. Russian troops push forward near Sumy and Pokrovsk. The enemy is now dangerously close to the Dnipropetrovsk region border. Kharkiv under massive attack. Several people killed, dozens injured, including children. US military aid to Ukraine will be reduced. The Pentagon chief outlines Washington's new policy. A growing threat to global security. Russia deepens ties with North Korea. All that and more in this episode of Ukraine Today. Hello, we are from Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Robchun. Click subscribe, like this video, and let's get started. We begin with a drone strike on the Tambov gunpowder plant. It's one of Russia's main suppliers of explosives for the military. They produce gunpowder for rifles, artillery, rocket systems and various components for other explosive materials. A legitimate target, or better yet, a legitimately hit target. Russian forces are pushing near Sumy and Pokrovsk. The invaders are now dangerously close to the Dnipropetrovsk region border. More on the situation next.
This video shows the transfer of Russian equipment and personnel from occupied Crimea and the Kherson region. Afterwards, the equipment and soldiers are transported to the border of the Sumy region, where the occupiers are conducting an active offensive. According to the reputable source Deep State, the Russian army has entered the Sumy region and is already within FPV drone strike range of the regional center.
Kendratovka and Alexievka, after clarification, have moved into the red zone. The enemy has completely occupied these settlements, is amassing infantry there, and continues its attempts to advance deeper into the territory. Next on the occupiers' path is the village of Khotin, which they have targeted for occupation and consolidation, as well as attempts to infiltrate Malaya Korchakovka. In this area, the Muscovites have managed to get within 20 kilometers of Sumy. Therefore, over time, we can expect FPV drone strikes on the city once the appropriate crews are brought in and there is no active hunt for them on our side.
The border communities, as well as the city of Sumy, are under constant shelling. Currently, an evacuation has been announced in Sumy region from 213 settlements across 18 frontline communities.
At the moment, there is no reason to evacuate the city of Sumy. The situation remains difficult along the line of combat engagement, but it is under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Since the end of last month, Russia has amassed more than 50,000 troops in the Sumy direction, and thanks to the large number of infantry, the occupying army has managed to seize more than a dozen settlements. In the Donetsk region, the main targets remain Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk. Every day, in this direction alone, the Ukrainian armed forces repel at least 40 offensive operations.
Overall, the Russians have not advanced toward the city at all throughout the entire year 2025. The front line south of Pokrovsk remains relatively stable. What they are doing now is expanding the flanks westward toward the Dnipropetrovsk region and establishing a stronghold between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka, which in turn will become a problem for the remaining supply lines to Pokrovsk in the future if this stronghold continues to grow.
The Russian army is actively advancing along the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka highway, which runs to the east of the city of Pokrovsk. With these actions, the aggressor is trying to bypass Pokrovsk from the other eastern side of the agglomeration, or move toward Kostiantynivka and encircle it from the west.
The occupiers are now advancing from the eastern side of the Pokrovsk agglomeration with very large forces, moving very actively precisely for control of this Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka highway, which runs east of the city of Pokrovsk, and could give them two opportunities if they manage to advance far enough north. In principle, either of these options is unpleasant. One of these options opens up operational opportunities for them. That's why we need to make sure they don't manage to break through and develop such an advance.
On June 8, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that its troops had crossed the administrative border and entered the territory of the Dnipropetrovsk region. This information was also published by the Deputy Chairman of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev.
They, the Green Aphids and their patrons, have been warned. Those who refuse to acknowledge the realities of war at the negotiating table will face new realities on the ground. Our armed forces have launched an offensive in the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Chagrin skin of the Banderite state is shrinking. The disinsection against the patriots continues.
Kremlin press secretary Dmitry Peskov called the entry of the Russian army into the Dnipropetrovsk region the creation of a buffer zone. However, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine called the statements of Russian top officials untrue and denied the information that the enemy is in the region. And here is what a Ukrainian soldier with the call sign Muknoy wrote on his channel. He is currently right on the border between the Donetsk and the Dnipropetrovsk regions.
At the moment, the enemy has advanced 3 kilometers north of Kharkiv. In this way, they managed in this sector to reach the border of the Donetsk region and cross a small ditch into a forested area in the Dnipropetrovsk region. This was done more as physical confirmation, and what happens next remains to be seen.
According to the Deep State resource, since the beginning of this year, Russia has occupied 1,300 square kilometers of Ukrainian land. The command of the OSUV Khortytsia stated that during the occupation of 1 square kilometer of Ukrainian land, Russia loses 146 soldiers, 1 tank, 2 armored vehicles, and 5 artillery pieces. And even for Russia, these are enormous losses. According to Ukrainian military sources, Russian officers who have been taken prisoners say that the summer offensive is being positioned as a final push intended to break Ukraine's morale.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It really helps. Russia lost at least 1,120 troops from yesterday, killed and wounded. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, that's already 999,200 Russian soldiers. Just 800 more to hit the first million. In the last 24 hours, Ukrainian defense forces also destroyed 8 Russian tanks, 15 armored vehicles, 34 artillery systems and many more units of Russian equipment. Meanwhile, Kharkiv came under massive attack. The city suffered serious destruction. At least 3 people were killed, 64 were wounded, 9 of them children. Odessa region was also under fire again. A Russian strike damaged homes, cars and civilian boats. Luckily, there were no casualties. In Zaporizhia, however, 2 civilians were injured by a Russian FPV drone that struck their car. The Trump's administration supports providing Ukraine with advanced air defense systems to counter massive Russian missile strikes. That's what the US State Department spokeswoman, Tammy Bruce, said at the briefing. According to her, the United States remains Ukraine's strongest supporter and ally.
We are doing and continue to wish to do as much as we can. That is not disputed. And I understand the Ukrainians, who are great friends of this country and have done, there's no disputing the bravery and the commitment of the Ukrainian people. If that was ever in doubt or questionable, this war and how they've defended their nation has dispelled any of that. I had the pleasure of being in a bilat with a Ukrainian delegation recently here, and they are astounding people, and they're remarkable, and they are committed to getting their country safe and this war to end. And so are we. The United States has proven that. The details of which are many, and I can't speak to that, and I certainly would dispute that we are not letting Ukraine do something. The opposite has always been the case.
But at the same time, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said Washington would be cutting its aid to Ukraine.
It is a reduction in this budget. As you know, this administration takes a very different view of that conflict. We believe a negotiated peaceful settlement is in the best interest of both parties and our nation's interests, especially with all the competing interests around the globe. I don't think the word victory has been well defined, or the path to it. And as a result, a path to peace that stops the killing and the carnage is something that President Trump is very invested in.
As you see, not much details. So it could mean we'll support Ukraine less, or maybe we'll just be more responsible with what we give. In other words, we'll be watching closely how this unfolds. But I do have a few thoughts here. Mr. Hegseth said the word victory needs clarification. How about this? Forcing the terrorist state to withdraw from Ukraine, stop killing people and stop destroying cities. Also, compensate for the damage. Then let the Kremlin call it their own victory, if they want. They can celebrate anything as long as they stop attacking others. And when we hear that this administration has a very different view of this conflict, well, it sure looks like different departments within this administration have different views. The State Department says one thing, the Pentagon another. Some clear coordination and consistency would really help here. As for the idea of negotiated peaceful settlement, let me quote the head of the Russian delegation, Vladimir Medinsky. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal, he warned that if Kiev doesn't make concessions, Ukraine will lose even more territory. He also said Russia is ready for a long war, and even compared it to the Northern War. Well, Medinsky forgot a couple of things. This isn't the 18th century, and modern Russia didn't even exist back then. So, how do you negotiate with someone who says surrender or it will get worse? Fortunately, Ukraine already gave a clear answer to that. On the first day of the full-scale invasion, it came from Snake Island. Yeah, Russian warship, go yourself.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Ukrainian engineers have successfully tested a new ballistic missile in combat conditions. Its warhead weighs around 400 kilograms and it can hit targets more than 300 kilometers away. More coming up.
At a time when Russian aggression continues unabated, Ukraine's long-range weaponry is becoming not only a symbol of strength, but also a real guarantee of security.
Our missile program has good momentum. And although this is a difficult task, we are gradually getting closer to being able to use our own missiles and not just rely on supplies from our partners. And not just rely on missiles supplied by our partners.
In 2025, there was a breakthrough in the production of Ukrainian missiles. The greatest anticipation was focused on the production of a domestic ballistic missile. And now it has happened.
I believe that the supervisors made a good choice, both in separating the program from other programs and in assigning each missile system and missile type its own supervisor and manager. This is a positive development. As far as I know, tests were conducted in mid-May, and they are considered to have been extremely successful. The missile traveled almost 300 kilometers and destroyed a Russian command post. And it is very important that this was a combat use.
A Ukrainian-made ballistic missile covered almost 300 kilometers and destroyed a Russian command post.
The warhead of this missile weighs over 400 kilograms, and that is a very powerful arsenal. For comparison, the new American ballistic missile has a warhead of only 91 kilograms. It's clear that this will be a powerful weapon for us. I hope that we will continue to move forward.
President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly said that the Ukrainian ballistic missile is already on the way.
I have instructed that separate funding be allocated to our Ukrainian ballistic program for faster missile production.
One of the versions currently circulating claims that the Ukrainian armed forces have already been attacking enemy targets with ballistic missiles for a year. After all, many experts and analysts have, from time to time, been unable to identify the weapon used to destroy enemy targets.
The first time successful results were announced was by the president, I believe, sometime in July or August of last year. And since then, there have been several instances when strikes on Russia were carried out. There is a suggestion that Ukrainian ballistic missiles were involved in these strikes on Russia.
A domestically produced ballistic missile is truly a breakthrough for the Ukrainian defense industrial complex.
Ukraine had been working on such projects even before the war began, and some of these projects were already at the stage of being almost ready, that is, at the prototype level, ready to be adopted into service. Since Ukraine needed to develop its own missile program, in this missile program, which essentially happened in 2023, all the projects that were in a more or less prepared, finished state were revived. And they were used to begin the development of Ukraine's own ballistic missile.
Some speculated that this referred to the Ukrainian ballistic missile of the Sapsan complex, which the president of Ukraine mentioned last year.
Nowhere is it stated what kind of missile this is, what it will be called, or its specifications. In fact, it's more likely that the internal components have been modernized, rather than the appearance internals, rather than the exterior. And now all the necessary organizational and management structures have been established to actively move this project forward.
After successful testing, the Ukrainian ballistic missile and tactical complex is expected to go into mass production.
The optimal option would be a missile with a range of up to 712, around 700 kilometers, and a warhead equipped with a good guidance system, ensuring high accuracy in the payload of at least 200 kilograms. Of course, if it's more, that would be even better.
This would allow us to deliver serious strikes against the entire military-industrial complex of the enemy.
A missile with a range of 300 kilometers and a 400-kilogram warhead, as stated in the specifications for this missile, will allow us to destroy targets at the operational tactical depths. This is also very good because, in fact, all command and control, all military logistics, all depots, they are located in this zone.
Ukraine has already made attempts to develop a ballistic missile over the past 30 years. At that time, domestic capabilities were limited by the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty.
Everyone remembers that when Oreshnik appeared, we learned about the existence of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. What was it about? It was about the fact that the country, specifically the parties to this treaty, which are Russia and the United States, do not engage in the development of intermediate range missiles. And an intermediate range missile, meaning a ballistic missile, is defined as having a range from 500 to 5,500 kilometers. And when Trump, while he was president, first learned from intelligence that the Russians were developing the RS-26 missile with a range of less than 5,500 kilometers, he broke off, he withdrew from this treaty, and then Russia also withdrew from this treaty.
A country undertakes the obligation to produce missiles with a range of no more than 500 kilometers, but only for domestic use.
If they produce them for export, then the range must not exceed 300 kilometers. So I think that the Ukrainian development of this ballistic missile is currently within the framework of export restrictions, but I am almost certain that its range will be increased to 500 kilometers.
The Ukrainian defense industrial complex is making successful progress in developing weaponry.
I think it will evolve towards a range of 500 kilometers. Perhaps the warhead might be slightly reduced, but I believe that most likely, even without reducing the warhead.
Ukraine's missile program is a strategic factor in the country's security. This is a breakthrough and a trump card in the hands of a country defending itself against Putin and his military machine. The development and production of Ukrainian missiles will allow the country to independently address the destruction of Russia's military capabilities in its aggressive war against Ukraine.
Russia's cooperation with North Korea is already affecting the war in Ukraine. That's according to Ukrainian intelligence chief Kirill Budanov. He says Pyongyang is supplying weapons to Moscow, for example, North Korean ballistic missiles. The first batch was poor quality, but with help from Russian engineers, the missiles were improved. And Russia, in return, is giving North Korea drone tech, missile upgrades and nuclear development tools. A real threat to global security. And finally, Russia is building up its military potential and may attack NATO countries within the next 5 years. Looks like the alliance is finally starting to see what Putin is really after.
NATO Secretary General Rutte stated Russia is planning to attack alliance countries within the next 5 years.
Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years. 5 years? Let's not fool ourselves. History has taught us that to preserve peace, we must prepare for war.
There are numerous factors and intelligence data indicating that Russia is indeed preparing for war with NATO.
The Russian Federation is increasing its military presence on the borders with Finland. This involves the construction of military bases, airfields, ammunition depots, and accordingly, an increase in the number of personnel directly near the borders with NATO countries.
Even though the Russians are spending a lot of resources on the war in Ukraine, they are producing several times more weapons than the NATO countries.
As for ammunition, Russia produces in 3 months as much as all of NATO produces in a year. It is expected that this year alone, its defense industry will produce 500 tanks, 3 zero-armored vehicles, and 200 Iskander missiles.
The Russian side itself admits that at the moment they are mainly using stockpiles of Soviet-era weapons. In other words, this is the very armored equipment that was kept in long-term storage depots. On the one hand, it's a demonstration of growing military capability, but on the other hand, it's actually a sign of the degradation of the Russian defense industry and its inability to reproduce the latest models of weaponry.
NATO is also concerned about Russian drone and missile strikes, following the example of what has happened in Ukraine.
We need to strengthen our air and missile defense by 400%. All of us are now on the eastern flank. The new generation of Russian missiles travels at speeds many times faster than the speed of sound. The distance between European capitals is just a matter of minutes.
In addition, according to the expert, if there is an attack, the Russians, as always, will rely on sheer numbers.
Apparently, the Russian Federation will focus primarily on tactics from the Second World War. This means an advantage in manpower. In other words, the well-known tactic, often referred to as Zhukov style, which the Ukrainian side knows as so-called meat assaults, or in the Russian interpretation, we won't spare the cost in lives. That is why the main advantage the Russian Federation has over NATO countries is its virtually unlimited mobilization reserve.
Rutte is concerned not only about Russia, but also about its allies Iran and North Korea, and most of all China, all of whom are also expanding their military capabilities.
China is also expanding its nuclear arsenal and intends to have more than 1,000 operational nuclear warheads by 2030. Those who oppose freedom and democracy are entrenching themselves, preparing for a long-term confrontation.
Rutte openly stated that if the bloc countries do not start increasing defense spending and arming themselves, they should prepare for life under occupation.
If you don't agree to spend 5%, you might still have a healthcare system, a pension system, and so on, but you will have to learn to speak Russian. I was told, Mark, if you bring these harsh facts to the surface, it might be a shock for the public, but they should be on alert. This is our reality.
European states understand perfectly well. If Ukraine cannot withstand Russian attacks, the next target of the Russian occupiers will be NATO countries themselves, primarily Poland and the Baltic states. Moreover, the possibility of a direct armed intervention against Finland and Sweden is also being considered.
It seems that Europe has finally woken up, and European leaders have realized that it is impossible to negotiate with the aggressor. If they do not want to end up under Russian occupation, they will have to defend themselves.
That's all for today. Thank you for being with us. We read your comments and we feel your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and see you next time.